For everyone joining, just a reminder, we'll just give it a couple minutes to make sure everybody has a chance to get on here before we get started. Just about 2 more minutes here before we actually get started. Looks like we still have a few people joining. Just 1 minute. All right, I think we'll go ahead and get started. So as always, welcome. Thank you so much for being here with us. I'm Alisha Babbstein. I'm the archivist here at the Oregon Jewish Museum and Center for Holocaust Education. I am joined today by our Curator of Collections, LeVant Prahl, and the Director of the Museum, Judy Margles. We wanted to share with you today some fun and interesting clips from our oral history collection, specifically focusing on synagogues and rabbis. Just a note, as with our other presentations, these are completely episodic. So we begin and end with what we find the most interesting. This will not be a chronological talk today. We really just let ourselves be driven by the interesting quotes that we found in the collection. Like our other topics, there are just hundreds of stories about these synagogues and rabbis. So if anyone's interested in learning more, just let us know. We'll happily share whatever we have. And just a quick note, this talk also only focuses on Portland. So I think as of 2019, there were 40 plus congregations in Oregon, and we'll have to get to those at a later date. Today is just Portland. And as always, you have Anne and Judy to guide you through this wonderful history. We also want to let you know up front that some of these clips are a little harder to hear than others. We've done our best to clean them up, but like the others, they are done, starting in the 70s, and some of them are better than others. So we have a presentation for you today with the quotes in the PowerPoint, so you'll be able to read along for those with those audio pieces that are a little tougher to hear. And last reminder, we have, as always, the comment box, the chat box, and the question and answer box open. And we just would ask that if you can remember to use the chat box for comments and the Q&A box for actual questions, which we will hopefully get to at the end today. And with that, I will go ahead and jump right in. Actually, Judy's going to go ahead and talk. Sorry.
Because I think this is the third or fourth time we've done this program. It really is important that Anne and I, just all of you, just join us in a shout out for Alisha, because she is actually the one who puts the quotes together, who creates the slideshow for us. So Alisha, I don't know that you've been properly thanked in these programs. So we thank you from the bottom of our heart.
Thank you, Judy.
She's a master.
All right, here we go. We were going to jump right in with a clip from Fran Wolf.
The wonderful thing when the High Holy Days would come, there were a group of us, and we would walk from synagogue to synagogue. And so it was fun on Yom Kippur. You know the old Jewish story about the three men who were lost on a desert island, and when they were rescued, there were 10 synagogues. Well, that's just what's happened to Portland. Yeah, if you don't like it, you form your own synagogue. And, it's, sometimes I find it vastly amusing, I'll be honest.
So I it's really too bad that we're on Zoom for this quote because I would love to see everyone's faces. Honestly, when I moved to Portland, boy, it's been over 30 years ago, but when I moved here, I was really mystified by the number of people who belong to more than one synagogue. And put in the chat, or put in the chat if that's your experience, because what was so amazing is the number of people who not only belong to more than one synagogue, but actually frequented them as well. So you'll see in this, this is a slide, it's just showing you some of the more, some of our many esteemed rabbis in Portland. And as we move through the presentation, you're going to learn more about them. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. So this is, there's not a clip here, but this is also just an opportunity for you to see, again, just a sampling of some of the synagogues in that were built in Portland. I'm really just going to talk about one in a little more detail. If you look on the upper left-hand corner of your screen, that is Oregon's first synagogue building. It was Beth Israel. It was built on a 400 square foot lot at the corner of Southwest 5th and Oak in downtown Portland. The building is no longer standing, but it was built by Absalom Halleck. He was hailed as Portland's first architect. There are other buildings of his still standing. The building was designed. It cost a total of $4,500. It seated about 200 people. And actually, at the time it was built, I mean, it's a beautiful building. And if you think of it in 1858, when it was built, it would really have stood out for a jewel. At the time it opened, the Oregonian wrote that it was quite an ornament to that part of the city. The Jewish Messenger noted that it was finished with much neatness and taste. But I just want to point out that even though at the time it opened to the press being laudatory, just a couple of years before that, the Oregonian had actually published a number of anti-Semitic blasts against the community. I'll just read you one of them.
Judy, before you start, people are having a hard time hearing you. Do you have headphones perhaps, or
I'll
or
talk
come a little closer?
better if I talk louder.
Let us know in the comments if you're having a better time. Someone also did in the Q&A saying that they couldn't really hear you.
Oh no, I'm so sorry. And I actually left my headphones at home. Oh, hold on. I have another pair. But I'm going to keep talking while I put them on just to keep going. I'm so sorry about this, but.
Well, while you're putting them on, I can just point out to people that it's important to remember that these synagogues were really close together. The area that they were built with the even the first Beth Israel, well, they're all in. Do you know the exact measurement, Judy? But it's not many blocks apart from each other that these synagogues, they're all walking distance, just like that quote that you heard at the beginning said. It was very easy to walk from one synagogue to the other, and many, many houses in between each one housed people who went to several of the synagogues for different parts of their week and parts of their praying and communal Jewish life.
Yeah, no, thank you, Anne. Now I can't remember, can you hear me better now?
Much better.
Okay, good. I apologize for that. Did I read the quote from the Oregonian, the anti-Semitic quote?
Not yet.
I'm going to read it. Okay, just so you have this context in the very early days of Jewish settlement in Oregon. So we're talking the late 1850s, the early 1860s, and the Oregonian wrote, "What have the Jews done for the benefit of the American nation, for religion or morals, that they should with swaggering arrogance claim exclusive rights and privileges denied to other sects and creeds?" So it wasn't always easy. But just moving on and looking again at this slide, and I just want to talk about three sort of defining features of synagogue life. One, early 20th century synagogues in Portland were defined by mergers. For example, if you see next to Beth Israel, the 1893, I guess I can't point my cursor, but Neve Tzedek was built in 1893, and then in 1902, it merged and became Neve Tzedek Talmud Torah. And then in 1961, it merged again to be Neve Shalom. It merged with Ave Shalom to become Neve Shalom. That's just one example of a number of mergers that happened in the community. And then there were the rabbis too. It wasn't only people like the first clip we heard of people frequenting different synagogues, but often the rabbis themselves went from synagogue to synagogue. 1863, Julius Ekman came from San Francisco. He became the first rabbi at Beth Israel. We know he received a salary of $1,000 a year, in case anybody's looking to go into the rabbinate. And he was really swept up in this conflict between tradition and reform, right? He was actually too rigid for Beth Israel. They really wanted the congregation at the time, of course, it was a small congregation. They were so eager to modernize the service. So Rabbi Ekman only lasted 3 years there. But this desire he had to preserve the traditional aspects of Judaism, it made him the ideal rabbi for another emerging synagogue, and that was Ave Sholem, which synagogue is that?
It's the bottom left.
Bottom left, there it is, the first Ave Sholem there, thank you. Which was formed in 1869. One other example of a rabbi who frequented a number of synagogues was Rabbi Joseph Fein. I'm going to talk more about Rabbi Fein later on, but he appeared to have some very unique spiritual abilities, you might say, as he routinely served as rabbi in 3 synagogues at once: Lineth Hazedek, Sherei Torah, and Kesser Israel. So he was a tiny little man, and you can just imagine him, as Anne said, the synagogues were close to each other. So you could just imagine him doing this circuit on Saturday mornings or Friday evenings. I think we can go to the next clip. Alisha, thank you.
I'm going to go ahead and read this one because Miriam was a little tough to hear in her clip. So the interviewer asks, "What are your recollections of Stephen Wise?" And she answers, "Well, to my mind, they were perfect. Everybody, really. It was wonderful the way the congregation would really fill up pretty well when Stephen was there. He was the essence of brilliance, wonderful and handsome, very handsome."
So I think Stephen Wise might be a name familiar to you. He went on, he left Portland for an illustrious career in New York. So he was the rabbi at Beth Israel between 1900 and 1906. And I think it's reasonable to say that he had a profound influence in those 6 short years, both in Portland, on the congregation and in Portland. He came here insisting on what he referred to as a free pulpit. He wanted the right to speak and really expound without interference. He was very progressive. He advocated for social causes such as women's suffrage. In Oregon, women got the right to vote in 1912. So he was advocating in his time here. He went on to New York to continue to advocate for universal suffrage. He advocated for child labor restrictions, workers' rights, suppression of vice, which was a problem. Any of you who heard our Jews in Business talk, we talked a little bit about vice then, and also juvenile justice reform. He was a supporter of the newly formed Portland section of the National Council of Jewish Women. He actually was it was really his idea for this neighborhood guild, for a neighborhood guild that became Neighborhood House. He held Bible classes for women at Beth Israel. He also advocated for interfaith relationships. So if you think of just those first years of the 20th century, the idea of Bible classes for women was quite novel. And I just want to say that as Miriam Aiken says, he was quite handsome. You can see in that photo, and I'll just a case in point, the American Israelite, when they were announcing that Stephen Wise was coming to Beth Israel and he took the job, they wrote, "It will perhaps interest the ladies of Portland to know that Reverend Weiss," as rabbis were known in those days, "Reverend Weiss is under 30, unmarried, and decidedly good looking." So there you go. I'm going to just stay with this for a little bit and we'll just move to the next slide. Anne, anything you want to add in or okay?
Not about Rabbi Weiss.
Your cursor, perhaps, can you point to the spires of Beth Israel? Yeah, if you can see if you see in the, look in the middle of your screen and then slightly over to the left and up, you're going to see these 2 amazing spires. These are the spires of the second Beth Israel synagogue. You know, by the mid 1880s, Beth Israel had a membership of about 150. They only counted the men, so we know there were 150 men at that time. They'd established a cemetery school, the Hebrew Benevolent Association, and of course, they were still in their synagogue at Southwest 5th and Oak. But they needed they really wanted a grander synagogue that better reflected the prestige, the wealth of this nascent growing congregation. And they made provisions and constructed the second larger synagogue, which opened in 1888 at Southwest 12th and Main in downtown Portland. Architect was Warren Haywood Williams. He was acclaimed for his Victorian architecture. If you know the building, the old church, which is still standing, that was built by Warren Haywood Williams. And so this was a very impressive wood building. It quickly became known as one of the most decorative structures in Oregon. It had these ornamentals, you can see in the slide, these ornamental twin towers, and they were really familiar city landmarks for everyone. And there were some changes that occurred while Beth Israel occupied this site. And this was really, I mentioned Rabbi Ekman and this, he was really holding on to tradition. Beth Israel was really reforming itself. And that's really what took place in this congregation, this reform using what was called the Minhag America. So let's just go to the next, let's just hear the next clip and hear what happened to Beth Israel.
I'm going to play Howard Wolf and then I'll read you a second clip.
Great.
The old congregation Beth Israel was on Main Street, and it was a beautiful wooden structure, but someone set it on fire. Living on 10th Street, my mother grabbed me and brought me up in the attic, and she says, there's a terrible fire over there. Then it dawned on both of us that was the synagogue going up there. And we had a caretaker, we call him a shamus, and his name was Olson. He grabbed the Taurus and ran out, but he was burned quite badly. They'll tell you at Beth Israel we're 150 years old. Some days I feel like it, but seriously, I would say I was maybe 5, 4. I can remember it, the flames and the smoke, because we could, up in the attic, could look right down on it.
I'm going to read you a piece from the dedication speech from David Solis Cohen in 1928 at the dedication of the Flanders Street building about this fire. He says, "There are those present who may have stood, as I did, watching in shocked grief as the destructive forks of fire made their way to those 2 majestic towers of Beth Israel, which, from the moment their lofty heads were reared, has been a landmark of the city, visible from every quarter, arousing a sense of reverence coupled with the admiration of those who viewed their graceful beauty. We trembled indeed in sorrow and apprehension, dreading yet expecting to see those towers fall and crash to earth, as the fierce flame shot through them and encrimsoned the heavens as far as the eye could see. But the towers of Beth Israel did not fall. They remained above the ruins when the fire had abated, to be as tenderly and reverently removed as they had been erected."
Thank you, Alisha.
I'm sorry, Judy. We have pieces in the archives that survived both this fire and a later flood, and you can see the damage to them, but many pieces managed to survive that.
Right, those are in our archives and on our collection. Yeah, so this was a fire that took place December 29th, 1923, completely, as you can see by the photographs, destroyed the Congregation Beth Israel's second building. I just want to point out 1923 was sort of the pinnacle of the success of the Ku Klux Klan in Oregon. In 1925, the KKK was thought to be Oregon's KKK was thought to be the largest Klan west of the Mississippi. So as you can perhaps imagine when the synagogue burned down, everybody was concerned that it was a fire set by the KKK, and there was this sort of increased concern about anti-Semitism in the community. It was later discovered that it was not an arson fire set by the KKK. What we understand actually sort of bizarrely is that it was a disgruntled firefighter who felt that this person needed more recognition. So kind of an odd fire. It was an arson fire, but not tinged with any kind of anti-Semitic overlay. But once the fire took down the synagogue, I think what I want everyone to know is how much the community at large, the larger community, rallied together to help Beth Israel. So there were offers from churches in the area. Ave Sholem helped as well. The synagogue went to the B'nai B'rith Center, which was nearby. It had opened in 1914, so they were able to meet there and hold services. And the congregation immediately decided to rebuild on the same site. But then a few years later, the year later, 1924, the congregation, the board approved building at 19th and Flanders, where it is today. Anne, if you want to add anything to Beth Israel, please do. If not, I'm going to hand it over to you.
All right. So we're going to go ahead and listen to Joy Levy-Alkali first.
Well, when I first came here, most of the families had a German background. And also, already at the time that I got to this congregation, it was a little bit, as you would say, watered down, or it wasn't as pure German as maybe it was when the congregation was first founded, because you already had the Schmanski family here, and they certainly were not German, and were an integral and an honored part of the congregation, or a pillar of the congregation, let's put it this way. And you had other, people here who were not purely a German background. I mean, you had some Russian background.
I think just the fact that she is aware of which members of the congregation were German and which members are not gives you an idea of how big an issue this was in Portland, as it was all over the United States. The Germans who had arrived earlier had businesses, they had more money, they had more standing in the community than their Eastern European counterparts. That the picture there is the beautiful Byzantine synagogues building that's standing today on Flanders. Did you talk about its architect? Did you talk about Brookman at all, Judy? I don't think you did. This is a Herman Brookman building, and it's based on, oh gosh, I shouldn't have started that sentence because I can't remember the name of the synagogue in Germany that it's based on. But if you have the chance, if you're in Portland and you have the chance to go inside it, it is definitely worth the visit. We have a picture coming up of some parts of the inside. But Joseph Schmanski, who she mentions in her quote, is there on the right, and he was a very early Polish immigrant to Portland. He arrived here in 1889, which was still the early tip of the Eastern European immigration to the U.S. That immigration that didn't really end until 1924 when the laws were changed. He typifies the kind of Eastern Europeans that you saw in the early days of Beth Israel, in that he was a very successful businessman. He was not peddling on the street. He was not living in, he was not living in South Portland. He owned the Eastern Outfitting Company, which part of its business was to provide the clothing that was sold by peddlers door to door. He had several retail locations, one of them right downtown, and he also sold his second grade goods through peddlers around the city. He also opened a store in Astoria and sent his brother off to open a store in Seattle. So he was quite a big enterprise. I love his quote that we have of his that says, "The riches of a community are its citizens." And he was a philanthropist both to the Jewish community and to the entire city. If you've ever been on the campus of Portland State University, right behind the Arlene Schnitzer Concert Hall is the statue called Rachel at the Well that Joseph Schmanski donated to the city of Portland. I think that's, I could talk about Joseph Schmanski all day, but I think that I'm done. Why don't we go ahead and, why don't we play the quote from Harry Gervertz?
When my sister Fanny died, I was executor of her estate, and she made some very fine bequests. One of them especially is those beautiful bronze arch doors at Temple Beth Israel that depict Moses at the burning bush, which are open now in every services because they contain the spot where the Torahs sit, the most religious and revered spot in the synagogue.
So those are, that picture on the right is the bronze doors that he's talking about. They are stunning. And when you get to go inside of Beth Israel, you'll get to see them too. The Gervertzes are another Polish family that were very early members of Congregation Beth Israel. So it was not all German, although, and really the difference between Northern Poles and Germans was less than Southern Poland, because it's just an arbitrary line there. Harry and Fanny's father, we think that's Fanny there on the left, by the way. We think that this is a picture of Fanny and Sid Crone. If anybody can verify that for me, I would love to know it. We know that they are Crones, but we don't know if they are Fanny and Sid for sure. But there must be somebody out there who would recognize them. Their father was Polish born, and he got to Portland even earlier in 1876. And he was a very early Polish member of Beth Israel. Perhaps because his wife was German, don't know for sure, but his wife Celia Gerson was German, and Rabbi Jacob Bloch married them at Temple Beth Israel in 1896. All right, I think we're ready to move on.
I just want to thank you, Eliezer, for reminding us the name of the synagogue in Frankfurt. It was Frankfurt am Main. That was the synagogue. Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Would you like me to play Abe English?
Am I doing English? Oh, yes. Well, I can't talk about it until you hear him. Yes.
My dad was strictly Orthodox. He went to shul every morning, every night. And we lived around the corner from the congregation Neve Tzedek. And anytime they needed minyan, there were 5 boys and 2 girls at our place that never missed for a minyan, because the shamash used to walk around the corner to our house and would come back with enough people for them to have a minyan. So they always had a minyan there, and I grew up in a strict Orthodox family.
One of the benefits of having your synagogue, steps away from your home, if you're Orthodox, is that you don't have to drive to them. And the other, on the Sabbath when you're not driving. And the other benefit is to the synagogue is that there are always people around to make up a minyan. And I wanted to just, for the people in the listening audience who aren't aware of that, there is a quorum of 10 people that you need, and in an Orthodox synagogue, that's 10 men that you need to to say many of the prayers. And it's so important that it's one of the commandments that men are obligated to do. If you are walking down the street and a synagogue needs a 10th person, they just grab you by the arm and drag you inside. And it's your obligation to be that 10th person so that the prayers that need to be said can be said. I think we have other examples too of, I can just imagine it. The sound of the voices going through the streets calling out for it. Play Gussie Reinhardt's quote, if you would, Alisha.
As a child, I can remember lying in bed in the early mornings and hearing somebody go through the streets hollering, Tveit Minyan, or Dreit Minyan, or Eins Minyan, and this is the way the minions were formed at Kesser Israel in the early mornings, every morning.
Obviously, the best situation would be if you showed up at synagogue for minyan and there were 9 other people waiting there to pray with you. But clearly that wasn't always the case. Gussie was born and raised in Kesser Israel. She died, I think she died at 96, and her father was one of the founding members of Kesser Israel, and a long-standing president of it, so that when Gussie died and left her papers to the Oregon Jewish Museum, among them were boxes and boxes of synagogue papers that her father had kept at home, and it had never made it back to the synagogue. That is the picture of the interior and exterior of the Kesser building that Gussie is talking about, that was still in use, I believe until 2006. Yes, Judy?
Something.
I think they sold it in 2006 and moved to the neighborhood where their congregants live again, so that they could walk to services without having to drive on the Sabbath. All right.
So we're going to go across the river to North Portland for the next clip.
When this synagogue on Northeast Going had been put on the market is when the synagogue at that time found themselves involved in a civil rights problem. It became a problem only because the majority, who were the whites in the community, had objected to the fact that the buyers happened to be black, a black congregation that wanted this building. I'm talking about the neighbors surrounding the Tiferet Israel synagogue. They evidently did not object to the Jewish element at that time. But when the black congregation in 1952 found this as a good location for their congregation to move into, when some of the people, as I'm saying, the majority of whites surrounding the synagogue found that it was blacks, we had to fend off people who were vehemently objecting to the idea, and that they wanted us not to go through with the sale. But we couldn't do that, of course, morally.
I mean, she's very concise and clear in what happened in 1952. It was a synagogue that was built in a former house. So we're in the Alberta neighborhood. It was the synagogue was called Tiferet Israel. It was also known as the Alberta Shul. It served largely Russians and Ukrainians. So, it's just good to have this perspective, because we think that the Eastern Europeans settled in South Portland, but some of them didn't. Some of them ventured across the river into Northeast Portland. The building was off of a gravel road. You think of Northeast Portland right now, or North Portland, and how much it's built up, but at the time it was off of a gravel road. And it actually expanded to include over time about 100 families. So they outgrew the building, needed to move on in 1952, as Irene said. They wanted to sell the church. It was the Mount Sinai Community Church who wanted to buy it, an African-American congregation. And if we think of 1952 and a little bit about Oregon history, so the number of Black people in Oregon was relatively little because of exclusion laws that had been enacted in 1844, well before Oregon even became a state. So it was during the war, needing people to work in the Kaiser shipyards, that more Black people came to Oregon to work in the shipyards. After the war, they were displaced from where they were living. They were living in a community called Vanport that flooded. They needed to move into the city. Realtors and bankers immediately redlined the city to make sure that Black people wouldn't be in areas where they were unwelcome. North Portland was one of the places they could go. So here you have a situation in 1952, an African-American congregation is trying to buy a building. The white people in the community aren't letting them do that. So it really does speak to Jewish values, Jewish tradition, to be out there for the other. So, what a timely story to hear about this small Jewish community in Northeast Portland trying to help this other community. I do want to just read you a letter that they wrote to the realtor who was trying to get them out of the deal, because it's very beautiful. It says, "In welcoming our colored brethren to our old synagogue of blessed memory, we are mindful of the quotation from Hebrew scripture, 'Have we not all one Father? Hath not one God created us?' We hope that they will also find God within its walls, and that he will answer their prayers, and that he will teach us to love one another. In the event that you refuse to close the sale, we desire to be released from our listing agreement so that we may ourselves consummate the moral agreement we have entered into." As Irene mentioned, there were petitions by the neighbors. The sale, of course, did go through. Okay.
It's worth noting too that there's a group of Jews on the east side today who are trying to revive the Alberta Shoal, not this building, I believe, but their second building, which came up for sale several years ago, and they are they're in it now and fundraising to try and make I don't think a synagogue, but a community center and a place for Jews to gather in Alberta.
That's correct. Tifereth Israel actually served in the location it moved to until 1986. Then it merged with Sherry Torah. So it does not exist anymore. I'll turn it back to Anne.
Okay. Let's listen first.
Well, we belonged to the Sherry Torah on First and Hall, and everything was real good there. And in fact, when I got married in 1923, they had fixed the basement up with a beautiful floor for dancing, and mine was the first wedding downstairs. We had 200 people, and they had these beautiful floors, and all the social events, everything was around the shul,
It was much more common before then and at that time for people to get married in a rental hall or even in somebody's home or a yard. So the fact that the synagogue was big enough and had the accommodations to have 200 people dancing in the basement is kind of special. Take a look at that arc light above the synagogue there. That helps us date this image that we don't have a date for. I'm not sure. I think we're saying it's before 1910.
We are.
Just a little bit about Sherry Torah and Lineth HaZedek too, which we're going to hear about next, I think. There was a lot of socialism coming from these Russian Jews who came and started synagogues in Portland. The group who founded Sherry Torah had come via North Dakota, Their original name for their organization was the Hebrew Sick Benefit Association, which is not a great name for a synagogue, but they were, they had that name for 10 years. Then they bought land for a cemetery, which is the first thing that many groups of Jews do. Even before they have a building to pray in, they buy land for a cemetery. And the land was purchased under the name Hebrew Sick Benefit Association. And then later, I think in 1914, they changed their name to Congregation Sherry Torah, Gates of Torah. But most of the people in South Portland always just referred to it as the First Street Shul, because that's where it was. It was an Orthodox shul, women upstairs, men downstairs. And that lasted until just after World War II. And there are a couple different firsthand stories of how that changed. There was a mothers club of women who made the decision together to take a stand and come down the stairs and sit with their husbands. And Frida Gascon, who is still alive at 101 and still a member of Sherry Torah, remembers that when the servicemen came back from the war, their girlfriends and wives were not going to be parted from them for long enough to have services. And they came down to, which happened pretty smoothly. I don't think very many people left the synagogue over it, but it did lose its Orthodox status. And for many, many years, it was referred to as a traditional shul. I think for more than 10 years now, it has been associated with the conservative movement. We're going to see, are we going to talk about other buildings of it? Yeah. There we go. Okay, let's listen to Sadie.
And of course, my father was very, very well known in the Jewish community here. He was a pillar of the Sherry Torah synagogue. He was called Mr. Sherry Torah for many years. He was president of Sherry Torah for 23 years. For 23 years. That's right.
That is quite a tenure. I'm going to make another request to the congregation. If anybody has a picture of Boris Geller, Boris Cohen, we want it. I'm gonna start speaking more slowly now. Boris Geller was Sadie's husband. The person we want a picture of is Reuben Cohen, her father, Mr. Sherry Torah. So if anybody has a picture of Reuben, let me know, because we would love it. Her story is also a story of South Portland itself. Sadie was born in Belarus and settled in South Portland and married Boris, who also was settled in South Portland. But by 1941, they had a successful grocery store business, and most of their friends had already moved to the east side of Portland, where really anybody who could was, and any Jews who could, were moving to from South Portland at the time into Irvington and Laurelhurst and into Grant Park. And so in 1941, they moved their business. They sold the grocery store and moved up to Fremont in Irvington to have their grocery store. And they and the rest of the Jews who lived on the east side continued to go back to South Portland to pray until those synagogues weren't there anymore.
And I just want to point out that this Sadie Cohen Geller is not related to Yonah Geller, who of course went on to be the longtime rabbi of Congregation Sherry Torah, two different Geller families.
And let me tell the story about this building that you're looking here. It's the saddest story. During urban renewal, the synagogue got the notice that they were going to have to move to sell the synagogue to the city because 405, the expressway, was going to run right through it. And they did, and they sold, and they talked to the city council, and they chose another site that they were assured was a better site, which is on the campus of Portland State University now on Park Avenue. And they were there for 5 years. And I think I have a quote here. I can't find the quote quickly enough, but it was like the day they opened, they heard from the city that in 5 years they were going to have to move again. So they moved way up to Northwest Portland, to 25th and Lovejoy, where they still are today, and opened in the 1960s. Okay, next slide.
You can go ahead and play that one.
Very funny incident happened a little later. Us kids we throw nuts to see who was closest to the end. And the winner, we're just kids. One day into Portland came a rabbi with a big black beard. See, Rabbi Fein, who was rabbi of Curator, had a big red beard. But this man came from the east somewhere. He says, I'm more Orthodox than even Rabbi Fein. And so he tried to get some of the members to quit Curator and go with him. So he rented a house just up the block from Curator, just one block. So anyway, my dad being a maverick too, he was one of the 10 or 12 that went with him, figuring he was more Orthodox. Big deal. Well, about a year goes by, the police came to town and picked up this rabbi. He wasn't a rabbi. He was wanted in Chicago for fraud or something. And anyway, we went back to Curator.
Love that story.
It's a great story. Yeah, rabbis were, well, I'm going to tell you, actually, I'm just going to digress a little bit from thinking specifically about synagogues, because I think it's worth sharing a couple of stories about Rabbi Joseph Bane. So I'd already mentioned that he had served, he seemed to have these miraculous abilities to be in 3 places at once when he was the rabbi at Sherry Torah, Lineth Hazedik, and Kesser Israel. He really was, by all accounts. And if anybody who's listening in has any stories about him, any family members who talked about him, just put in the chat, because we'd love to know. But apparently he was very, very charismatic. And indeed, he had this long red beard. Unfortunately, we don't have a color photo of him. So because of his red beard, he was called the Reuter Rabbi, right? He, in addition to being 3 places at once when he was rabbi at these 3 synagogues, he actually traveled throughout the Northwest. He performed weddings and circumcisions. He supervised the milling of flour for Manischewitz, for the Manischewitz company in Tacoma and Spokane. And he also served as a ritual slaughterer, the shochat. I mentioned that he did circumcisions too. His record wasn't seamless, however. I'll just tell you 2 stories of how he got in trouble. And Sura Rubenstein, if you're listening, we do a shout out for Sura, who told us about, who turned us on to the archival material supporting these stories. So apparently in 1918, he ordered members of his synagogue to refrain from eating meat butchered by a particular meat market in South Portland, right? And what happens? The butcher gets into a fist fight with Rabbi Fein. The butcher was found not guilty. The lawsuit was dismissed. And actually the whole thing was covered in the Oregonian with the headline, "Peace is again restored." But poor Rabbi Fein, he gets into another controversy 6 years later. Again, the reports are kind of vague, but apparently due to a lack of harmony in the congregation, he was asked to leave Sherry Torah altogether and become the rabbi at what was called the Little Synagogue at Mead and First Street, Kesser Israel. And then, of course, he was forgiven. He went back to Sherry Torah. Okay, Anne, I'll turn it over to you for Harry Arnsberg. If you have questions, do put them in. I see some people are putting questions in the chat. I will make sure we have time to get to them.
And my earliest recollections was that we attended the little synagogue on the front in Arthur, which was called Lineth Hazedik, and which was moved several times since then after the building of the Ross Island Bridge. And at some times we attended the Kesser Israel, which was around the corner from us the Mead Street Synagogue, as it was called. Most of the synagogues were called after the streets in which they were located, such as Kesser Israel was called First Street, and Abba Shalom was called Park Street. And I think the only one called by its actual name was Temple Beth Israel. Even the synagogue in Alberta was called the Alberta Street Shul, even though it's on Wygant, but that was the original location, Alberta.
Well, he's very clear. Lineth Hazedek, this, like he said, it was in many different locations. And again, it was also founded by Russian Jews who arrived and wanted to preserve their very traditional way of praying, the Russian and Romanian Jews, I have to say. And they founded it under the name Free Loan Society. That was the first, that was the organization of people who founded the synagogue, was the Free Loan Society. And they shared with the founders of Sherry Torah the socialist leanings and interest in communal living and communal life that they brought with them from Russia. They were the meeting place throughout the 20s and the 30s for ICOR, which was the Organization for Jewish Colonization that was seeking to settle Jews in collective settlements, first in Russia and in Europe, and later in the United States as well. And they had those meetings at the synagogue building. When Sherry Torah made that last move that I told you about to Lovejoy, they brought with them the remaining members of Lineth Hazedek, which it merged into Sherry Torah at that time. We're good.
Good. Okay. Let's go to the next clip.
Yeah, we had the women sat upstairs and the men sat downstairs. The entire service is in Hebrew. There was no English. Mm-hmm. And yeah, it was very Orthodox, it's very Sephardic, because we don't have Orthodox conservative and reform, but it's very Sephardic in its very traditional way. They opened up the last row on the main level for women to sit. The women that were
in the men's section.
In the men's level. The women's level was the balcony. But some women couldn't climb the stairs as they got older, so they had one row in the back for those that couldn't climb the stairs. If you could climb the stairs, the women were upstairs. But, for example, my Uncle Isaac's mother was Vava Rivka, they used to call her. She was 101 years old. She was the first one to sit downstairs because she couldn't make it upstairs anymore.
Uh-huh.
That's great.
I wonder if that is true. I remember going to Kesser Israel before they sold their building in 2006, and they had, most of the women were upstairs in the balcony, but there was a small area on the main floor for women. I wonder if it was the same reason for women who couldn't climb those stairs.
Just listening to that clip though, and hearing the interviewer, we haven't yet had the interviewer's voice creep into our oral history clips, but it does make me want to just say very, very briefly that of course you're listening to the voices of the people being interviewed, but it is really a testament to the interviewers who have helped us gather this information for the archive. So just a shout out to everyone out there who may be an interviewer, anybody who's interested in interviewing. I think Anne and Alisha would be thrilled to expand the oral history collection. So I'll just say that. But let's talk a little bit about Avarakim. It was the first Sephardic congregation in Oregon. Those original members came from Turkey, Isle of Rhodes, and they were all descendants of Jews, of course, who had been expelled from Spain in 1492. And this was really the third wave of Jews to emigrate into Oregon, the first wave being the Central European Jews, the second wave being the Eastern European and Russian Jews. This was the third. some of them arrived via Seattle, where they had already where there had already been a Sephardic community had been established a few years earlier, and some came directly from the Mediterranean. So around 1910, they began gathering. They formally organized in 1916. They met at the B'nai B'rith building. I'd mentioned it a little bit ago. And they called themselves Avarakim, Hebrew for brotherly love. In 1921, they collected funds, which they wanted to use for the purchase of land for a synagogue building of their own. And they endeavored to build the building that Richard's talking about. It was at Sherman and 3rd in South Portland. And if you know South Portland at all, there's this wonderful sculpture by Oregonian sculptor Lee Kelly, and that's sort of the area where the synagogue was. The synagogue was just a little to the west of where the Lee Kelly sculpture is. They started fundraising in 1921. It took them about 9 years before they could get their building. The original building, so their very first synagogue, it was a Moorish architecture, which was very popular at the time, but it also helped reflect their roots in Spain. August 31st, 1930, the building was completed, dedicated, services commenced. And for the most part, the people making up the congregants were working class men again. It was mostly the men who went to synagogue, who met for prayers. In the post-war years, the congregation was involved in philanthropic causes. They supported the state of Israel. And as Richard Matzes tells us, it was Sephardic and Orthodox, so separate seating for men and women. Then, 1961, the city of Portland declared South Portland an urban renewal district. Let's go to the next clip.
I remember going there to the site and seeing the building on the truck and seeing the crack and knowing that the building was going to be destroyed. Little did I know that in moving the building, it was decided by the congregation that they would move everything inside the building. Why take the books out? Why take anything out? They took the Torahs out, of course, but they left all the furniture and all of the books and everything inside. So once the building was condemned on the platform, there was no entry into the building, but we had a few Sephardic boys of teenage years, I guess you'd say. They went in underneath the building and they took a lot of stuff out at night. I don't know if it was planned by the board or not, but anyway, they went in and saved a lot of things. They brought all the books out and some of the plaques and things of that nature, whatever they could bring.
So Anne mentioned Sherry Torah, the story of Sherry Torah being a sad story in Portland synagogue history. I will venture to say the story of Avarakim and what happened to the synagogue is really the saddest story. So just to give some context to Richard's comments, what happened with urban renewal is the synagogues in South Portland were forced to relocate, all except Kesser Israel on Mead Street. All the other synagogues in South Portland had to acknowledge that their buildings would be destroyed. Avarakim, they were just so proud of this building that they had built, just a few decades before, and they determined they were going to move it to another location. They hired what they thought was a reputable moving company. We know the name. It was LeBeck and Sons, and they took out an insurance policy from Lloyd's of London, which would prove to be very fortunate, very prescient. They loaded it up on the flatbed truck. You can see on the left. They started to move. They didn't get more than 100 feet. It was a very, very hot day, and the road caved under the weight of the building. They actually discovered there were cracks in the support beams of the synagogue's dome, so the building had to be condemned. The moving company actually said the cracks were there before the move. That's what they tried to claim. They tried to claim that the cracks had been there since the building was built. And the insurance company declined to acknowledge liability because it was unclear when the damage occurred. But whatever it had to, they did have to condemn the building. So there was a lawyer, Paul Meyer, in town, determined that he would take on the case, and he went to fight on behalf of Avarakim, and won $100,000, minus $1,000 for lawyers' fees. So the congregation got $90,000. They received $99,000 in a out-of-court settlement for the damage to the building. I would venture to say, and if people are listening in who have direct experience, I would say no money was going to replace this building. This was an absolute knife in the heart to the Sephardic community, despite getting the money. And we'll just go to the next slide.
So we gave him a free hand, except for the religious aspect that he didn't know. We had to tell him that we have services at 6 o'clock on Friday. In the middle of winter, it's pretty cold. We want quick heat. We were in and we're out, you know, in an hour. And he gave us some furnaces that were high efficiency type furnaces that did that. But we told him we cannot use a microphone in our synagogue, so it's the acoustics have to be right. He got acoustical engineer. To this day, you can whisper for one corner of that synagogue, and you can hear it across the hall there.
So they took the insurance money, and they were able to rebuild. They hired a very prominent architect, John Storrs, built this building, which might be recognizable to many of you on Barber Boulevard. It was affectionately known as the Beehive Synagogue. They kept, John Storrs designed the building in the tradition, the Sephardic tradition, with this Middle Eastern style dome. And as Sam Menashe noted, the acoustics are absolutely amazing. And the stories I would hear about congregants in the building, they had to be very careful, because if you were sitting, if you look at the seating, if you were sitting in the back on the left, you could not gossip about the person sitting in the front on the right, because you could actually hear it. It's sort of like being in the Pantheon, right? So they, you know, a really tragic story, the moving of the synagogue with a good outcome. In 1961, they were able to rebuild the synagogue. It lasted in this location until 2015. And again, you know, a sign of the times, because many of the congregants want to be able to walk to synagogue. The neighborhood had changed enough that people weren't able to access in that way. So the synagogue moved again to Southwest Portland, right across the street from the Jewish Community Center. The building right now is owned by TriNet. So, and its outcome is still up in the air. They may have to tear the building down, but they haven't fully decided that. And I'm gonna, we're running a little late, so I'm gonna pass it back to Anne for the last slide.
All right, I'll try and talk
Looking
fast.
back from the time you came, how would you describe the changes in women's roles in the synagogue?
Oh, it's tremendously different. Of course, we had men and women sitting together. That's what we found when we got here. I cannot remember when women became part of the minion, but I do remember when Nahama did part of the service. So it was all connected. It was around her bar mitzvah. And then there were two gentlemen who always sat together. And one was Harry Gervertz. They lived in Hood River for many, many years. And when they finally moved to Portland, it was like he went out of Galut into the Gan Eden or something. He was so happy, but that's where he raised his family. His daughter is Esther Wayne. He had about 4 or 5 children. And they were taught in Hood River, but he taught them. And so he was here at Shul every Shabbat morning. And when it became obvious that Muhammad was going to do part of the service, but Mr. Steinberg said to Mr. Gross, he wasn't going to stay in there and listen to a girl do part of the service. And he left. And Mr. Gross, I mean, I give him a lot of credit. He was right up there with us, and he listened to her. He thought she was just wonderful. And then Mr. Steinberg came back in, and Mr. Gross said to him, "You big dumb fool, why did you go out? You don't know what you missed." But gradually, they accepted.
Neve Shalom was certainly not alone in having to ease people into the idea of girls and women being called up to the Torah. But they were first. One of those firsts in Portland. Linda Potter was the first girl bat mitzvahed in Portland, and she was bat mitzvahed at Neve Shalom in 1953. We don't have a photograph of her being bat mitzvahed. We have some great photos of girls and women for you here. That is Jemmy Costner Mansfield reading from the Torah there, and her mother Priscilla Costner behind her. And and that's also at Neve Shalom. And there's Bernice Feibelman, a longtime Portland person, at the Torah at Cedar Sinai, where she spent the last years of her life. There's Lori Levine reading from Torah, also at Neve Shalom, and her father, Leonard Levine, behind her. And Cantor Judith Schiff, there, who was the first female cantor at Congregation Beth Israel. And she was the first female clergy member of any kind who was hired by a Portland congregation. Yeah, I just have to say that Beth Israel also had early bat mitzvahs. Both the conservative and the reform movement jumped on that idea around the same time in the mid-50s. I think that we are done, and I do think that we do have some time if people can stay on to answer a few questions. I haven't looked to see what they are.
Do you know what the Hebrew on the bronze doors at Beth Israel say by chance?
I don't know. Can you go back to the picture of the bronze doors? I think it's a little too stylized for me to read, but maybe somebody else can.
No. Oh, it looks like the 10 Commandments. Oh, above.
It says Adonai Echad, God is one. All right.
Anybody have any questions to post? Someone asked who owns the Sephardic temple now, and I think I answered that. So it is owned by TriMet. They're just deciding what to do with it.
Somebody wanted to know the aerial photo of the city. Do we know what year that was? And I don't. I have my.
Oh, I think it was.
Well, it was before 1923.
Yeah, I think it was 1950. Something like 1950, 1915.
Okay, so those are those questions answered. I hope that you've enjoyed hearing about them. We have so many pictures of the synagogues and the people involved in the synagogues. It's one of our favorite things to go through. We are fortunate enough to have the archival collections from most of the city's synagogues here at the museum, which helps us do research and helps them, because when they need to know something about their synagogue or look up the date that somebody was married or died or converted, we have it at our fingertips because we actually keep these records organized. Works for researchers and also for the synagogues themselves.
So I want to thank everyone for joining us today. I think we're going to take March off, but I think we'll come back in April for another program. Haven't quite decided. Actually, if you have, let us know by email if you have any ideas of themes from the oral history collection that you'd be interested in. And thank you for joining us today. And
thank you very much.
Thank you, Alisha, again, for such great graphics.
You do all
just before we end, I just want to let everyone know this will be up on our YouTube later, and we will have it on our website on the recorded events page. So you can go back, try to listen to the clips again, read through it, or send it to friends.
Bye, everyone. Take care. Don't forget to come to our gala on March 7th, 6 p.m. We just sent out an email, an e-blast, about an hour ago. It's going to be short, sweet, and great. Thank you. Bye-bye.